There was a legend that had been passed down for generations in the small town of Millfield. It was said that a cursed doll resided in the abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The doll had belonged to a wealthy family that had lived in the mansion years ago, but tragedy had struck when their daughter died under mysterious circumstances. The family had left the mansion soon after, leaving behind the cursed doll. Many had tried to enter the mansion to retrieve the doll, but none had returned. The mansion had become a place of fear and dread, and people had stopped going near it. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the mansion. They had heard the legend of the cursed doll, and they were curious to see if it was true. They made their way to the mansion, ignoring the warnings of the townspeople. As they entered the mansion, they felt a sense of foreboding. The place was dark and silent, and the air was thick with dust. The floorboards creaked under their feet, and the only sound was the rustling of mice in the walls. They made their way through the halls, searching for the cursed doll. As they turned a corner, they saw it. The doll was sitting on a dusty shelf, staring at them with glassy eyes. One of the teenagers reached out to grab the doll, but as soon as she touched it, a chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, the doll's eyes flickered, and it began to move. The teenagers were horrified as the doll began to speak. Its voice was high-pitched and eerie, and it spoke of death and darkness. It tried to leave the mansion, but the doors were locked. The windows were barred, and there was no way out. As the hours passed, the teenagers realized that they were trapped. They were at the mercy of the cursed doll, and they knew that they would never escape. One by one, the teenagers began to disappear. The doll seemed to take pleasure in their fear and pain, and it relished in their screams. Finally, only one teenager remained. She was cowering in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. The doll approached her, its eyes gleaming with malice. As it reached out to touch her, the teenager felt a surge of anger. She refused to let the doll win. She grabbed the cursed doll and threw it across the room. The doll shattered against the wall, and a blast of energy filled the room. The mansion shook, and the walls began to crumble. The teenager stumbled outside, her body bruised and battered. She looked back at the mansion, watching as it collapsed in on itself. The cursed doll was gone, and with it, the curse had been broken. But the teenager knew that she would never forget the horror of that night. The cursed doll had taken everything from her, and she knew that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Haunted House on the Hill. In the quiet town of Ridgefield, New Jersey, there stood a house on a hill that was said to be haunted. The locals whispered of strange occurrences, eerie noises, and sightings of shadowy figures in the windows. The house had been abandoned for decades, and no one knew why. Some said that it was because the previous owners had been murdered there, while others believed that it was simply because of its sinister reputation. Despite its reputation, one family decided to purchase the house and restore it to its former glory. The family consisted of a husband, wife, and their young daughter. At first, everything seemed normal. They went about their daily lives, painting the walls and fixing up the creaky floorboards. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. At night, the family heard the sound of footsteps pacing in the halls. They heard doors slamming shut and windows rattling. They woke up to find their daughter talking to an unseen presence in the middle of the night. At first, the family tried to rationalize the occurrences, but as they continued, they knew that something was not right. The husband began to investigate the history of the house, and what he found was chilling. It turned out that the previous owners had been a wealthy family who had been murdered in the house. The husband was the prime suspect, and he had been found guilty and executed for the crime. The family tried to leave the house, but they found that they couldn't. It was as if the house had a hold on them. They were trapped, and they knew that they would never be able to leave. The family began to see the ghostly apparitions of the previous owners, and they were terrorized by their haunting presence. They tried to exorcise the house, but it only seemed to make things worse. One night, as the family sat huddled together, they heard a voice. It was the voice of the executed husband, and he was calling out to them. They followed the voice to the basement, where they found an old journal. The journal contained the confessions of the executed husband, and it revealed that he was not guilty of the murders. The real killer had been one of his servants, who had framed him for the crime. As the family read the journal, the house began to shake. The ghostly apparitions of the previous owners appeared, and they were furious. They were angry that their true killer had not been brought to justice, and they were determined to seek revenge. The family tried to leave the house, but they were surrounded by the ghosts. They were lifted into the air and tossed around like rag dolls. They screamed and begged for mercy, but it was no use. Finally, as the dawn broke, the ghosts disappeared and the family was left alone. They fled the house and never returned. The house on the hill remained abandoned, and the locals continued to whisper of its haunted history. But the family knew the truth. The house was cursed, and it would continue to haunt anyone who dared to enter its doors. The haunting of Millfield Manor. In the heart of the Virginia countryside, there stood an imposing mansion known as Millfield Manor. Built in the late 1800s, the mansion had been home to generations of the wealthy and powerful Millfield family. But as time passed, the mansion fell into disrepair. The last remaining member of the Millfield family had passed away, leaving the mansion abandoned and forgotten. It wasn't long before strange rumors began to spread throughout the nearby town. Some claimed that they had seen strange lights flickering in the mansion's windows, while others swore that they had heard ghostly whispers coming from the grounds. Despite the rumors, a young couple named John and Elizabeth decided to purchase the mansion and restore it to its former glory. They were both architects and were passionate about restoring historic homes. As they began to work on the mansion, strange things began to happen. Elizabeth heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, even though she knew that she was alone. John saw shadows moving in the corners of his vision, and he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. At first, they tried to brush it off as their imaginations, but as the occurrences continued, they knew that something was not right. One night, as they were sleeping, they were awakened by the sound of a child's laughter. They got out of bed and followed the sound to the mansion's old nursery. As they approached the room, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the ghostly apparition of a young girl, dressed in a Victorian-era dress. John and Elizabeth were terrified, but the girl seemed harmless. She smiled at them and then disappeared. Over the next few weeks, the couple began to see more and more ghostly apparitions throughout the mansion. They saw the figure of a man in a top hat, a woman in a flowing gown, and even the ghostly apparition of a horse and carriage outside. Despite their fear, John and Elizabeth were determined to solve the mystery of the mansion's hauntings. They spent long hours researching the mansion's history and the Millfield family. What they discovered was shocking. The Millfield family had been involved in a scandalous affair that had resulted in the death of a young girl. The ghostly apparition that they had seen was the girl's spirit, seeking justice for her untimely death. John and Elizabeth knew that they had to do something to put the girl's spirit to rest. They contacted a local medium and together, they held a seance in the mansion's old nursery. As they sat in a circle, holding hands, they called out to the girl's spirit. They asked her to forgive those responsible for her death and to move on to the afterlife. As they spoke, the room grew colder and colder, and the candles flickered. Suddenly, the ghostly apparition of the girl appeared before them. She smiled and then disappeared, leaving behind a feeling of peace. From that day on, the mansion was no longer haunted. John and Elizabeth had put the girl's spirit to rest, and they could finally live in peace. But they never forgot the lessons that they had learned, and they never took the mansion's history for granted again.